Welcome to the fifth and final hearing for the review of the Heritage Act 1977. Before I commence, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginals present. Today's hearing is being conducted virtually. This enables the work of the committee to continue during the COVID-19 pandemic without compromising the health and safety of members, witnesses and staff. Today, we will be hearing from a range of stakeholders, including experts in the field, the head of the New South Wales Government's Cultural Infrastructure Agency, and the President of the History Council of New South Wales. Before we commence, I would like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence today, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of their evidence at the virtual hearing. I therefore urge witnesses to be careful about comments you may make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that regard, it is important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide an answer within 14 days. Today's proceedings are being streamed live, and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. Finally, a few notes on virtual hearing etiquette to minimise disruptions and assist our Hansard reporters. Can I ask committee members to clearly identify who questions are directed to? And could I ask everyone to please state their name when they begin speaking? Could everyone please mute their microphones when they are not speaking? Please remember to turn your microphones back on when you are getting ready to speak. If you start speaking whilst muted, please start your question or answer again so it can be recorded in the transcript. Members and witnesses should avoid speaking over each other so we can all be heard clearly. Also, to assist Hansard, may I remind members and witnesses to speak directly into the microphone and avoid making comments when your head is turned away. I now welcome our first witnesses, Professor Richard Makai and Mr. Howard Tanner. Could each witness please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation, starting with you, please, Professor Makai.
My name is Professor Richard Makai, and I am appearing in a personal capacity. I'd like to take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Professor Makai. Mr. Tanner, could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation?
I'm Howard Napier Tanner, and I'm an architect in private practice, and I'll give the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanner. Would you both like to start by making a short statement? Professor Makai?
Thank you, Chair. I acknowledge that this hearing occurs on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, extending respect to any Aboriginal people in attendance. I'm a former member and former acting chair of the Heritage Council of New South Wales. I was the inaugural chair of the State Heritage Register Committee and the principal author of the heritage sections of the Commonwealth State of the Environment reports in 2011 and 2016. I've reviewed the Historic Cultural Heritage Act in Tasmania and provided strategic advice to heritage councils in both Victoria and Queensland, and my submission and appearance today are in a personal capacity. The terms of reference for this review are too narrowly focused on the Act itself rather than the total New South Wales heritage system. The discussion paper does not consider an appropriately broad range of options, nor was it prepared in a consultative manner. The stated intentions to make heritage easy, to make it work, and to make it relevant might be better presented as objectives, such as to identify, to protect, to manage, and to celebrate our precious heritage. The major challenges facing heritage regulation in New South Wales relate to the system rather than to the Act. Some of the problems mentioned in the discussion paper could be dealt with under the exemption provisions of the Act or by better application of other provisions. The current culture and process of regulators appears to be more focused on preventing change than on retaining heritage values. This practice can, for example, militate against adaptive reuse. What is needed is a shift away from regulation and a message about what you can't do to enthusiastic encouragement about what you can do with our heritage places. The Bathurst Showground, submission number 132 to this inquiry, offers a first-hand example, and I disclose my involvement as an advisor to the Bathurst Showground land manager. The category system proposed would inappropriately mix heritage identification, listing and protection with conservation and management. Different management of different types of heritage place would be better achieved through more effective guidelines and statutory exemptions. I acknowledge that the New South Wales Heritage Council and Heritage New South Wales are already making reforms and suggest that ongoing effective changes to the system, not changes to the Act, should be the priority. Finally, if there is to be any priority for statutory change to heritage in New South Wales, that priority should be Aboriginal cultural heritage, as the current legislation is deficient, does not reflect the diverse values of Aboriginal places, nor the proper roles and rights of Aboriginal people. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Makai. Mr. Tanner, would you like to make a brief statement?
Thank you, Chairman. I've been involved in the heritage area since the 1970s. I've been chairman of the Heritage Council of New South Wales. I've been a councillor of the Australian Heritage Council, and I've been national president of the Institute of Architects. I've been involved in a lot of heritage matters, and I suppose it's my practical experience that I think is one of the areas that badly needs to be addressed in the review of heritage in this state. I've been involved in major projects, the Sydney Town Hall, Admiralty House, New Zealand Parliament House, etc. So, you know, there's been a lot of experience there, and it's something that actually is currently sorely lacking. I think this practical experience of how you can get an outcome. The Heritage Act, as Richard has said, is not the problem. The problem is the administration of the Act. The Act's defined purposes are fine, but they're not being implemented. During the recent past, the protection of heritage in this state and nationally has been seriously emasculated. There has been a dumbing down of the Heritage Council and of New South Wales Heritage through lack of support, no real indication of positive future directions, and inadequate provision of appropriate expertise. The pursuit of a building approval has involved lengthy, complex and expensive procedures with very little authority guidance or assistance along the way, and this has damaged the public perception of heritage in New South Wales. Few buildings or precincts have been listed in recent years, and one is told that a preferred listing is dependent on the agreement of the property owner. Heritage is an element of planning, and no owner wants any controls over their properties. They want the controls over their neighbours' properties, as you would know. So really, we need to urgently protect the important elements in the state, and we need things dealt with in an assured and quality manner. However, planning controls must ensure that the heritage item or precinct is not placed under undue pressure due to inappropriate development controls in its vicinity. There have been some strange and inappropriate decisions coming from ministers in the heritage area, one being St John's Church, Camden, which I can talk about if you wish, and another one being the demolition of the Glengilling House in Vaucluse. There are major sites, and I can talk about them later if you wish, desperate for attention. They're often government-owned or with a large government influence, and they badly need addressing. And certainly, I think this question of expertise, both in New South Wales Heritage and on the Council, is something that sorely needs to be addressed. Not only expertise, but real practical experience. We know that you've got to give advantage to people if they're going to pursue heritage. There are questions here about tax relief. The National Trust has the best system, but it's never been expanded appropriately. And indeed, there's this question of whether rate relief could be readily implemented to assist heritage property owners. And so really, I think I must say that some good things have been happening. Late last year, the ability to self-certify simple works has come into place through New South Wales Heritage, and that has actually been a good thing. That's my remarks for the moment. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanner. I will now invite members of the opposition if they would like to raise questions. Mr. Primrose.
Yes, I'm Peter Primrose. Can I ask Mr. Tanner, you offered to talk about as an example what happened in St John's Church in Camden. Could you briefly talk about that, please?
Yes, Howard Tanner. There's a fantastic church in Camden called St John's, very important architecturally,
yeah.
and a landmark for the district, and provided with funds by the MacArthur family. And the church has been terribly keen to eternally subdivide the land and to build all sorts of structures around it. And it took a year of absolutely battering at the door of the then minister to get any consideration. And then when it occurred, it didn't actually protect the setting, and it didn't really protect the church in the manner that was required. And so it's that sort of unsatisfactory outcome. Yes, it eventually got a listing after a year of hard work, but in fact, it didn't protect the site.
Okay, thank you. And Chair, if I could please ask Professor Makai, one of your statements, I think, which struck me was that frankly, administration's focus is currently more on preventing change rather than protecting heritage. I was wondering if you could cite a particularly egregious example just to illustrate that for us, please.
It's Richard Makai. Thank you, Mr. Primrose. Look, I think a good suite of examples is contained within some of the terrace housing in Millers Point that was sold over recent years by the government to private owners. And obviously, these are expensive properties, and it's reasonable to expect a degree of change to accommodate contemporary residential living. Now, there are examples there, and look, I'm all for the conservation of original fabric and original form and ensuring that the important heritage values of that state heritage register precinct are retained. But that is taken to, in my view, an inappropriate degree when there are arguments about removals of small sections of floor joist, for example, in order to achieve effective transmission of food between a basement kitchen and a first floor dining room. And there is a recent example in the New South Wales Land and Environment Court of exactly that problem. And the issue there is resisting change rather than looking behind the specifics of the change to how the values of the heritage place can be best protected, including ongoing viability.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Primrose and Professor Makai. Mr. Buttigieg.
Thank you, Chair. Just quickly, it's a related question to the one that Mr. Primrose asked, but slightly different. So there was an emphasis from both of you on the problem not necessarily being the architecture of the Act, but the administration of the Act. But then I think Professor Makai, particularly you mentioned that there was a lack of emphasis on adaptive reuse. Can I take from that that the facility is there in the Act to engender adaptive reuse, or do you think there would be we'd need to make legislative changes to emphasise that adaptive reuse feature that you said is necessary?
It's Richard Makai. Thank you, Mr. Buttigieg. Look, my view is that there is not a need for statutory change, that the existing provisions, especially in Section 57, specifically Section 57.2, empower the Heritage Council to gazette exemptions. It's perfectly feasible to prepare different sorts of guidelines for different classes of place, be it a building or a landscape or an industrial site, and to accommodate adaptive reuse within those guidelines and associated statutory exemptions. And that would facilitate adaptive reuse. And I'd highlight that adaptive reuse is actually essential for many types of significant heritage place, redundant industrial sites, for example, or in country towns where you might have major buildings like banks, post offices, or Masonic halls, which are now no longer appropriate for contemporary use and require adaptation if they're to have a successful future and long-term conservation. And my suggestion is that this can be readily accommodated through better resourcing of Heritage New South Wales to prepare more guidelines for a broader set of classes of heritage place rather than putting effort into statutory change.
Thank you. Mr. Tant, did you have anything to add to that?
Howard Tanner. Look, I think one of the most important things is to have people dealing with matters who actually have practical experience. There's a lot of theoretical people out there telling us, particularly as Richard says, that you can't do this and you can't do that. What we need is people with experience who say, this has been done here, it was successful. You see, all our buildings, particularly, and many of our sites, require income if they're going to have maintenance. Therefore, they require a successful use. And so one of the jobs of the Heritage Council is to make sure that buildings and sites have a use and therefore have income and therefore have maintenance. And so you've got to have people dealing with these matters who actually been on a building site, who actually know how construction is resolved. And quite a few of the so-called experts do not have this depth of insight and experience that says, yes, it's possible to do that. It's like having a building matter being resolved by somebody who knows nothing about building. These are important considerations, that this depth of knowledge is available within the Heritage Council and within New South Wales Heritage. It's not currently present.
Thank you, Mr. Tanner. I'll now invite the crossbench if they have questions.
Yes, I have one.
Thank you, Reverend Nile.
For Professor Makai. Professor, your submission states, quote, whether the New South Wales Heritage Council would best support the objectives of the Act as an expert advisory body or a statutory consent authority. The Council currently fulfills both roles, and this leads to lack of clarity in listing and in consent decisions, as well as blurring of roles and misunderstandings about the relevant matters for consideration as revealed by the Cyrus building judgment. For example, what outcomes came out of the Cyrus building judgment that we can learn from?
It's Richard Makai. Thank you, Reverend Nile. The issue here, and it arises in a number of Australian jurisdictions and overseas, is a lack of clarity between the process for identifying something as having heritage value and then making well-informed management and planning decisions. And quite often this problem arises when the listing body itself is not clear about whether it's making the decisions based on heritage value or other considerations. And the Sirius building in Sydney's Rocks was an example of that. There was a judgment by the New South Wales Land and Environment Court a couple of years ago that is relevant. And the question here had to do with economic impact of the listing. And the court found that, in fact, the minister at the time had construed that particular consideration in an inappropriate manner. The issue, in my view, is that the Heritage Council itself and the listing process should relate to heritage values. And then when there are decisions about development or change or planning or adaptation, that is the time in which it is appropriate to take on board economic considerations or physical constraints and to make sensible decisions about what is necessary to enable a building or a site to be conserved. And therefore, it's quite helpful, and it's demonstrated in a number of jurisdictions, to have a separation between the listing, which might be done by an expert heritage council, and the decisions which might be taken at officer level or at ministerial level in a transparent, well-informed and accountable manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Just a follow-up question. In your submission, you state, according to the 2019-2020 annual report of the New South Wales Heritage Council, a document has been prepared called, quote, Future of State Heritage Register, Vision and Objective, end of quote. Apparently, this document is not publicly available. Is there any way you can arrange for this document to be made accessible to this committee even?
It's Richard Makai. Thank you, Reverend Noel. No, it's not within my power to release that. I think I'd have to suggest that question be referred to Heritage New South Wales or to the chair of the Heritage Council. The comment I would make is that even after 20 years, the State Heritage Register is manifestly not representative of the diversity of our state's heritage. And if the New South Wales government is to have a role in regulating state significant items and using that register as the tool, it's really important that that be done. So it's very surprising that there would be such a report commissioned by the agency that would not be publicly available and in play during the course of this review.
Thank you, Professor Makai. Reverend, I'll now go to Mr. Shoebridge. Mr. Shoebridge.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Professor Makai and Ms. Tanner, for your submissions and your time this morning. Professor Makai's made certain observations about the appropriateness of the three guiding themes in the, I think they're called the three key policy themes in the government's discussion paper: making heritage easy, putting heritage to work, making heritage relevant. Professor Makai, if I understand your position, is they may be relevant sort of as secondary objectives to a Heritage Act, but the primary objectives should be about conserving and protecting and identifying heritage. Is that how I'm to understand your submission?
It's Richard Makai. Thank you, Mr. Shoebridge. Yes, look, that's exactly right. I think I've made some observations in my submission about where heritage is not easy. We've had some commentary even today in this hearing about how to make it work more effectively. And obviously, as Mr. Tanner has said, making it relevant, making it viable. All of that is important. But frankly, making heritage easy, making it work, making it relevant, that's more of a slogan. In terms of core objectives, what do we need to do? Well, we need to identify it so that we can manage it. We need to provide protective mechanisms that are not mindful of the ownership. And then we need to have a good system for managing and celebrating that heritage. So it seems to me that that would be a better framework for any kind of statutory consideration or government policy guidance going forward.
Thanks, Professor. Mr. Tanner, did you have any views on that?
Look, I think that we all, certainly Richard Makai and myself, both believe that there is a great need to have absolute clarity in the system. And at the moment, we're not getting buildings listed and we're not getting them properly administered. I must admit, I speak largely about buildings since that's my background. But it is this question of making sure we know what the heritage of the state is, that it's recognised properly, and then it's administered properly. And I suppose one of the things for today is to make the case that we want heritage to move in a more positive direction. We want people to see it as a positive activity, not a negative activity. And I think that's been the problem of the last decade or so. So that's my concern, that people see heritage as a problem, a burden. They don't see it as something worthwhile. And indeed, maybe there's the question of incentives that needs to be touched on today, whether it's rate relief or whether it's a tax scheme through the National Trust or otherwise. I think the point is there has to be something that encourages people to see heritage as not only doing the right thing, but being encouraged to do the right thing in a very positive way. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr.
I'll
Tanner,
now ask-
could I ask you to specifically address those 3 points, though? This is what the government said.
My point of order, Mr. Chair.
Key policy
Mr. Franklin, Mr. Shoebridge, Mr. Franklin's raised a point of order.
I'm sorry, but we are going by the WhatsApp group, and the time for crossbench questioning has expired.
Oh, sorry, I missed that, Ben. I missed
okay.
the WhatsApp group. Sorry.
So I'll just ask members of the government if they'd like to raise a question, starting off with Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start with Mr. Makai. Your submission comments on the purpose of the Heritage Council and queries whether it should be an expert advisory panel or whether it should function as a consent authority. Would you be able to provide some more detail on your views in this regard?
It's Richard Makai. Thank you, Mr. Martin. Look, it can actually function as either, and that is a matter for government decision. My concern is that it shouldn't be an amalgam of both, either in terms of the composition of the Heritage Council itself. It should either be expert or it should be representative. And whether it's expert or representatives goes to the question of its ultimate roles. Is it the expert body providing advice to government at officer level and ministerial level, and expert body actually identifying what should be listed as heritage, or is it to be the consent authority? I think the mechanisms that work best are those where the State Heritage Council is predominantly the expert body providing clear and independent advice, and then an associated transparent government process which is accountable. And Victoria is the best Australian example of that if the committee wants to turn its mind to examples from other jurisdictions.
Thank you. A follow-up on this, you mentioned customised standard exemptions. Now, how do you see these functioning and what might be the conservation benefits for heritage items in that regard?
Well, it's Richard Makai. It's probably best to answer by way of an example. In the categories model that's put forward in the discussion paper, there's a suggestion that there'd be a separate category for landscapes. My view is there is no benefit in listing landscapes as a separate category, but there is every benefit in developing a series of specific guidelines and exemptions that relate to how cultural landscapes are managed. Now, that could be an urban cultural landscape. The town of Braidwood is mentioned. It could be a rural cultural landscape, so some farmland. There is an outstanding example of that in Australia, and that is the arrangements for the nationally listed city of Broken Hill, where the combination of local planning instruments and guidelines give rise to statutory exemptions under the Commonwealth legislation and mean that there is a common community understanding and an ease of management while at the same time conserving the heritage values of the town. So what I'm suggesting is that putting more resources into development of good guidelines with associated exemptions will reap far better rewards for the state's heritage and for the people that care for it than devising different categories of listing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Makai. Thank you. That's it from me, Mr. Chair.
Any other government questions? Mr. Mallett.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for your submissions. The two of you, distinguished people in this heritage area. Professor Makai and perhaps Mr. Tanner might like to answer this. Well, your submission suggests that there should be or could be operational incentives and to support owners of heritage properties to maintain them. Do you want to expand upon those for the purposes of the inquiry?
It's Richard Makai. Thank you, Mr. Mallard. I'll answer briefly, and Mr. Tanner, I'm sure will want to speak as well. The fundamental issue with heritage is that it's a community good, and yet the cost of providing that community good is borne by the owners and managers of the heritage place. And for the vast majority of heritage items in New South Wales, they are private owners. So they provide a public good, and there's a market failure because they're not compensated for that. So as I outline in my submission, there are a number of things that government could do to redress that. So there are some a guideline or arrangements such as transferable floor space or changes to allowable development. But the obvious one that the New South Wales government might contemplate would be some form of rate relief that relates to appropriate conservation works for listed heritage items at state level, at local level, or places that are contributory within conservation areas. That would make an enormous difference to the owners and managers of those places. And it would also be a fairer system because it would, if you like, share the burden of providing heritage to the broader community.
And rate relief would, of course, spread that that financial relief across the whole rate base of that local government area. I mean, you exempt a property from rates, it lifts only $1 or $2, but it lifts everyone else up. So it's shared by the community.
I guess it's Richard Makai. I'm not suggesting complete rate relief, but if for example there was a concessional rate for a heritage item in a conservation area relative to a property that's not a heritage item, that would be both a recognition and an incentive. You could decide to tie that to conservation works or not.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tanner.
Thank you. I'm Howard Tanner. I think that Richard's touched on the essential points here, but there's a sort of assumption that because you own a heritage property, you have adequate means to maintain it and protect it. Firstly, you might be enthused, but you don't have the means. Or secondly, you're definitely not interested. So we have to work out through rate relief or tax schemes or whatever, a mechanism where people can see that they're being encouraged to protect their place. They're also being helped to protect it. And I think that's the most important message we need to get across, because at the moment, there's so much negativity in this area, and we have to change that. Thank you.
It's the chair speaking. Can I take this opportunity to thank both Professor Makai and Mr. Tanner for attending this hearing and for participating. We will now be taking a brief break until 10:45 a.m. to assist with the changeover of witnesses. A friendly reminder to members, if you could please go on mute and turn off your videos until that time, and we will be resume at 10:45 a.m. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hey, Sean Mackin.
Hey, Walt, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good to see you. Hey, Peter.
G'day, Walt. Mr. Mackin, my name's Peter Poulos. I'm chairing this hearing. Could I ask you to help out with conduct a quick sound check, please?
Yeah, I'm hoping you can all hear me as I talk.
Perfect, thank you. And Ms. Pittman, could we ask you to help us out with a quick sound check, please?
Yes, Annette Pittman here. Hopefully you can hear me.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Gaps, quick sound check from you, please. Quick sound check, please.
Yeah, it's Stephen Gaps here. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you, Dr. Gaps. And Dr. Gaps, quick sound check from you, please.
Oh, sorry. Yep. Can you hear me okay? Stephen Gaps here. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you, Dr. Gaps. And Dr. Gaps, quick sound check from you, please.
Oh, sorry. Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Pittman.
Stephen Gaps here.
Yeah, Dr. Gaps, we can hear you, but you might close one of your streaming windows because there's a bit of delay. Yeah, Dr. Gaps, we can hear you, but you might close one of your streaming windows because there's a bit of
How's that? Is that better?
Good morning and welcome to the review of the Heritage Act 1977. The committee is resuming proceedings. I now welcome our next witnesses, Dr. Stephen Gaps, Ms. Anne Pittman, and Mr. Sean Mackin. Could each witness please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation? And could we start with Dr. Gaps, please?
Thank you. My name is Stephen Gaps, and I'm the current president of the History Council of New South Wales, which made the submission. I'm also a senior curator at the Australian National Maritime Museum and historian with a focus on frontier wars histories. And to make the affirmation. So I would like to, before that, I'd like to note that I'm also recently appointed to the Heritage Council State Heritage Register Committee and to the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Advisory Committee. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Dr. Gaps. And Ms. Pittman, could you please state your full name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation?
Yes, Annette Pittman, head of Create Infrastructure. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Ms. Pittman. And similarly, Mr. Mackin, could you please state your name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation?
My name is Sean Mackin. I'm a strategic advisor to the Committee for Sydney, and I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you, Mr. Mackin. And would you like to commence by each of you making a short statement? Dr. Gaps?
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. The History Council of New South Wales is a peak body for history in New South Wales. It was established in 1996 to advocate for history and foster the practice of history in this state. The Council aims to ensure that history in all its diverse forms is a central part of the cultural life of the people and communities of New South Wales. We provide programs and services which build capacity within the history sector and showcase the importance of history to both our members and general audiences. You may all be familiar with our signature event, History Week, which I note begins this Friday evening. I hope you'll all be joining, with the announcement of the New South Wales Premier's History Awards, and runs for a week with an array of community history events focused on this year's theme, From the Ground Up, which explores the role of history in renewal and regeneration in these challenging times. But I'd like to add the History Council does much more than History Week, and in areas of advocacy and fostering history, we focus on events, programs, and capacity building amongst our member groups across the state that focus on 5 key areas: awareness, diversity, excellence, advocacy, and research. Just briefly, I'd like to note the interest of the History Council in the review stems from a growing endeavour from the Council to diversify its aims and goals. In particular, increasing engagement with First Nations histories in New South Wales. Another area of growing interest and concern is heritage in the state. This interest stems from the Council's Value of History statement, which can be found on our website, that outlines 7 ways in which history is essential through shaping our identities, engaging us as citizens, creating inclusive communities, contributing to our economic well-being, and among others. The History Council strongly supports an invigorated emphasis on history as part of the heritage process. The Council believes history and historians are critical to understanding and assessing, interpreting, and disseminating heritage in all its forms, including built, cultural, and environmental. In our submission, we outlined a few suggestions in this area, including that historians should be an integral part of the Heritage Council, that the History Advisory Committee to the Council should be reinstated, and that the position of a state or chief historian should be considered for New South Wales. The Council's submission also strongly encourages a review of historical information for the existing State Heritage Register listings, as much of this is outdated and overly focused on such things as colonial houses. We also know that this and other suggestions can be furthered with increased resources rather than significant changes to the Heritage Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gapps. And Ms. Pittman, would you like to make a short statement to the committee?
I won't be providing a statement today, no, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pittman. And Mr. Mackin, would you like to make a short statement to the committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, the Committee for Sydney really welcomes the opportunity to appear before you today and to make our submission. Heritage, how it's protected and managed, is something deeply of interest to our membership. In preparing our submission, we held what we thought was going to be a small workshop. In the end, we had over 40 members participate in that workshop with their ideas on how the Act can be approved. And others also who weren't able to attend made suggestions as well. I won't go through our submission detail. You have that. I think the 5 key sort of takeaways for our membership and our members was firstly that we think the Act is fine but can be improved. We don't see there is a need for it to be for a wholesale replacement of it. It was a landmark reform in its day, and while it needs updating, it shouldn't be discarded. Indigenous heritage and how it is managed and governed, we think it needs to be resolved first. We understand this is subject to a separate process, but we think that should be finalised before any substantial reforms to the Act is made, and that should be done in consultation with Indigenous groups and organisations. How the Heritage Act interacts with other acts, in particular the Environmental Protection and Assessment Act, we think should be clarified and in some cases streamlined. We do support a tailored approach to managing heritage. The one-size-fits-all can be improved on. And finally, protecting heritage needs more resources and needs more incentives. We make a number of recommendations on how that might be done. In particular, we see there's possibly room for the expansion of the heritage floor space trading scheme, which operates in the city. We think there's scope for that to be applied to other parts of New South Wales. But I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee members might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mackin. Members of the opposition, do you have any questions for the witnesses? And I welcome the Honourable Walt Secord, who'll be joining us for this session, and he has a question.
Thank you, Chairman Poulos. I'd actually like to ask Sean Mackin about his very last mention. I think it was point 5, where he said he believed that the heritage floor space trading scheme could be expanded beyond what it is now. Can you elaborate on that, and how would that work in a country area?
Well, in short, it doesn't work. Answer the last point first. It doesn't work in rural or areas. It could really only work in areas where you can trade floor space, and that's CBDs, which have particularly high floor space ratios. In particular, I'm thinking Newcastle, Wollongong, Parramatta, possibly some of the other sub-regional centres, but it really doesn't apply to rural or remote or communities. It's not without its difficulties, but the committee noted that when you look at all the state heritage items that are in the CBD, every single one of them has, the built heritage items, I might add, every single one of them has been preserved, has an operating function, has a scheme by which they can be regularly renewed. When you look at the State Theatre or the Capitol Theatre, when you look at the Queen Victoria building, but then when you look at Wollongong CBD, Newcastle or Parramatta, the state heritage items in there are often empty. I'm thinking of the Roxy Theatre in Parramatta. I'm thinking of the Victoria Theatre in Newcastle or the Regent Theatre in Wollongong. Some of those buildings have now been boarded up for 30 or 40 years, and we think there is scope for at least consideration of a scheme to expanding the scheme to those CBDs. But that said, look, we know it's not easy. The city scheme has proven its worth, but it is complex, and but we think it's something that the government should be considering in partnership with those councils.
Mr. Mackin, actually, my next question was actually going to relate to the Roxy at Parramatta. So how would, in fact, heritage floor space help preserve the Roxy? How would you see it applying there?
Well, if you had a scheme that's, for example, the scheme that saved the State Theatre and the I'm having a mental block, the theatre down in Haymarket, the Capitol Theatre. If the Roxy wasn't a state heritage listed item, it'd probably, under the current zoning, be entitled to a floor space of about 16:1. It could hold a building whose height would only be limited by the flight plane from Sydney Airport, so you could probably get up to about 100 to 110 stories tall. Under a heritage floor space scheme, it would be able to notionally sell some of that lost floor space to neighbouring buildings, and any money raised though would be hypothecated to restoring the Roxy Theatre. Now that said, it's not an easy process. The Roxy has difficulties. It's not a fit for purpose at the moment building, but that said, it's at the moment pretty empty. It's been empty now for, I think, 6 years. If it's to ever come back as a fully fledged theatre, someone either has to buy it, or somehow there has to be some incentive or mechanism where it can achieve that. It's certainly not viable for the owner to just open it now as a theatre. And the same applies to the Vic and to the Region and other state heritage items in those town centres.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Mackin. Dr. Gapps, I'd actually like to go to your suggestion about a state chief historian. Can you tell me a bit about that? And how would that work, and how would that benefit heritage protection in New South Wales?
Yeah, thank you. Stephen Gapps here. I think that there's in several ways a position the council sees it as something like, in other areas you have a chief scientist, you have a chief representative of various organisations at different levels. But history is often neglected as something that I think is taken for granted in many ways. We don't see many, for example, local councils, apart from the City of Sydney and one or two others, that actually have historians on board. And I think on a smaller scale, that is really beneficial in the heritage process, where you've got, for local council, for example, huge amounts of effort from local heritage staff. That when you have historians in play, you have access to people and research and an understanding of broader landscapes that are not necessarily that well understood by people whose roles are much more focused upon heritage fabric, for example. And I think the role would complement in terms of advice to the council, assistance, and in generating projects that I think, such as regional studies, for example, that need to inform local sites and heritage issues.
Dr. Gapps, are you familiar with the state government's Blue Plaque program?
Very, very briefly, minimally, yes, but not to a great extent.
Okay, well, you're familiar with the Blue Plaque program that exists in the United Kingdom. Would you be familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if you're not that, I was just going to canvass your opinion about the Blue Plaque program, but I was wanting to move it towards Aboriginal heritage and frontier wars and that. And how do you feel if that would work in that regard?
Yeah, I'm actually still trying to work that out myself, and I would like to see what considerations that Aboriginal First Nations groups are actually giving to that system itself before I make any assessment. I'm unclear at the moment, and I'm with the Heritage Council. I must say I'm on a steep learning curve at the moment in all these areas. So I'd rather not give a firm assessment, and I'd also rather, in terms of frontier wars histories, I think, as I've heard other people speaking about in this forum, I think it's very important that is driven by First Nations organisations and peoples in the first place. And I don't know if a plaque is considered appropriate in some cases. In some cases, it may well be.
If a plaque isn't appropriate, what other commemorations, markings, or recognition occurs in, I guess, in other jurisdictions, or in, I guess, North America, Canada, the United States, or in other jurisdictions in Australia? How do they mark, I guess, atrocities that have occurred?
I'm not clear that this is quite as relevant as I think, but from my understanding, it's often in very different forms, and it depends on local communities in the first instance. But I suppose, in a general sense, I could say, from my understanding, that a common thread or form of commemoration that is led by First Nations peoples is not necessarily plaques, but perhaps landscapes, places, other sort of community inspired memorials.
Now, you would probably be aware from previous evidence and from media coverage of this hearing and other previous things, that New South Wales is the only state without a standalone Aboriginal cultural heritage legislation. What's your view of that?
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with the ins and outs of the act and the legislation in that area, and I'd prefer not to make a too clear. Well, I can't make a clear statement about that, but I from what I understand from what I've seen and heard in this forum, I think there are some concerns that needs more prominence, certainly more attention.
Ms. I'm saying, I think is Ms. Pittman, Create New South Wales. Yes, several weeks ago, the Arts Minister Don Harwin made comments about the state government and the City of Sydney working together to protect the Minerva Theatre in Potts Point. Are you familiar with the project?
Yes, I am familiar with the project. Just bear with me one moment as I get to my notes.
Yep.
Yes, I am familiar with the project.
So has anything happened other than the arts minister making comments in the media about it? Has anything tangible happened?
So we have partnered with the City of Sydney to conduct a feasibility study, which was co-funded by New South Wales government and the City of Sydney in late 2020. And that would look into the restoration of the Minerva Theatre and whether it could reopen and operate sustainably as a performance venue into the future. The study identified that there was a commercial market interest into operating the theatre, that it is operationally viable to reopen the theatre.
Right.
And
right.
that document is available on Create New South Wales's website.
Mm-hmm. So the proposal was to create a 1,000 seat venue. How does that work in with the commercial project? Can the commercial project so it would be, because it's within the center of within Sydney Sydney City Council, is it a state project or is it a Sydney City Council project?
Sorry, Mr. Secord, I didn't fully understand the question. Could you repeat that, please?
Okay, well, I was actually going back to the approval processes. So is it a project that has to be approved by the state, or is it a Sydney City Council approval project?
Well, the Minerva Theatre is privately owned at present, and therefore the decisions and actions going forward are in the hands of the current owners, and that the building, of course, is state heritage listed. So there's an aspect of future plans needing to go through, of course, the state heritage process as well.
It's the chair speaking. It's the chair speaking, Mr. Secord. It's now time for the crossbench to raise questions.
Okay, thank you.
Reverend Noel or Mr. Shoebridge, any questions?
Yes, I had one for Dr. Gapps. In your submission, you state historians have been underutilised in assisting the Heritage Council of New South Wales and Heritage New South Wales in the overall heritage process, in particular the valuable services of professional historians. I would have thought historians would have been a very important part of the council's work. What is the reason that they have been overlooked?
No, you're correct, Stephen Gapps here. You're correct that historians are very important to the Heritage New South Wales, and are members of the council as well. And obviously, I think I was appointed as an historian, and there's obviously a push and an importance placed upon historians in both the council and Heritage New South Wales. But it's a broader. I guess we're talking about the broader heritage environment, and when we're talking about all the consultants and all the areas of the process of heritage that are not necessarily utilising historians in the way that we believe that they could be utilised, particularly in assessments, in various ways. And particularly in as I mentioned before, in generating historical understanding in terms of background papers, regional studies, that sort of thing that goes to inform the process in general.
What's the reason that they have been overlooked? Is that some sort of bias?
Stephen Gapps again. I think one reason is an added cost. One simple reason is an added cost to the process to employ an historian when, particularly these days, it's a lot easier for everyone to be an historian.
Finally, in your submission, you said the History Council of New South Wales supports the 4-category tiered structure. Quite a few of the submissions we've received do not support the 4-tiered structure. Why are you supported so strongly? Dr. Gapps.
Dr. Gapps, could you recommence your response to the question from Reverend Noel, please?
Terribly sorry. Stephen Gapps again, off mute. We don't strongly support that, but we saw some merit in that, in some kind of principle that might adjust the levels of the listings, but we also supported the connection of historians in that process if there was to be one.
Just following up, if I've got time for one more quick question.
Yes, thank you, Reverend Noel, and then I'll go to Mr. Shoebridge.
Okay, a question to Ms. Pittman, head of the Create Infrastructure, submission number 70. This is a question. Aboriginal communities have asked for a building to be earmarked as an Aboriginal War Memorial Museum. They need a place where they can exhibit a number of movable heritage items that relate to the Aboriginal wars and massacres, etc. Do you have any views on that proposal? Do you support it?
Annette Pittman here.
Dr. Pittman.
Create New South Wales Cultural Infrastructure Plan 2025, which is our sort of guiding policy document for our organisation. It recognises the need for infrastructure and supports the cultural practice and economic empowerment of Aboriginal communities. This includes the need for Aboriginal keeping places and cultural centres, and appropriate storage and digitisation of Aboriginal cultural heritage. Create Infrastructure is currently working with Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales and the Stolen Generations Council to establish keeping places at 4 New South Wales sites of significance for the stolen generations. The particular project, Reverend Nile, that you mentioned, I'm not across in detail, but also just to mention that there has been an allocation made for a fund that will fund the type of projects that you've just described, and we'll be opening a round of applications for that later on this year. So there's some opportunities perhaps for that project to submit.
Thanks, Chair. I might just have some questions from here. Ms. Pittman, how much is that fund? What's the total in the fund, and what's the cap for individual grants?
Mr. Shoebridge, the Creative Capital Fund is there's $60 million in the Creative Capital Fund. The guidelines for that fund are currently being worked through. I might just describe the fund a little bit.
No, sorry, Ms. Pittman, I don't need a detailed description of the fund, but you would accept, wouldn't you, that $60 million, even if 100% of it went towards establishing a standalone museum about the Frontier Wars, would probably not even be adequate if the entirety of it was directed towards a museum about the Frontier Wars, which was really what Reverend Nile was asking you about.
I see. Well, Mr. Shoebridge, without the information about the scale of the project and the detail of the project, it's very hard for me to comment particularly about it.
That's okay.
But yeah.
That's okay. If that's your answer, but we might just move on. Mr. Gapps, when was the History Advisory Committee disbanded from the Heritage Council? Are you aware of when that happened?
I'm not sure of the exact date. I'd have to get back to you on that.
Is it your view that if we are reviewing the Heritage Act, that there should be an express reservation for a professional historian to be on the Heritage Council? Is that what I understand is your view?
Yeah, I think that would be a representative for example, the PHA, the Professional Historians Association, which is like an industry body for historians, would be appropriate.
Mr. Mackin, do you have a view about whether or not, if there is assuming there are limited parliamentary and government resources, whether or not the reform of First Nations heritage should be the priority, or the reform of the broader Heritage Act should be the priority, as is currently happening? Do you have a view on that, Mr. Mackin?
Well, our view was that how Indigenous heritage is maintained and protected and the governance arrangements around that need to be resolved. Our members make the point that the organisation which is in charge of protecting our flora and fauna is probably not the appropriate organisation to be also managing Indigenous heritage. But how Indigenous heritage is to be managed should be done in consultation with Indigenous organisations and peoples. We understand that is happening. We were of a view that needs to be resolved before there is significant reforms to the Heritage Act, because increasingly looking anomalous, if I can put it that way, how we are managing Indigenous heritage.
Yes, it'd be fair to say that in my consultations with First Nations peoples and community members about this, the continuing insult to First Nations peoples about having their heritage and culture classified effectively as flora and fauna under the National Parks and Wildlife Act is a continuing sense of genuine and real and legitimate grievance. Is that what you have picked up in your consultations, Mr. Mackin?
That's certainly what we've picked up in consultations.
Dr. Gapps, do you have a view about where the priority should be at the moment, whether this review of the sort of broader, largely European, although not exclusively, heritage, or First Nations heritage? Where should Parliament's attention be directed right now?
Stephen Gapps here. I agree broadly with what Mr. Mackin was saying previously, and I think there needs to be definitely a strong focus on First Nations histories in terms of its relationship with the two different acts, as well as the current register and listings and the information and inclusion of First Nations histories in those.
Ms. Pittman, does Create New South Wales have a view about whether or not the primary objectives of the Heritage Act should be about identifying and protecting heritage rather than making it easy or making it work? Does Create New South Wales have a view about that in terms of a priority?
Certainly the Create New South Wales appreciates that the Heritage Act is about the protection and cherishing of our heritage, and certainly supports. I think many of the projects that we've been involved in have celebrated the heritage of the individual properties. So, certainly working with the Heritage Act is very much part of what we do.
But Ms. Pittman, your submission is silent on that critical point, and the government's discussion paper doesn't prioritise protection and identification of heritage. Is there a reason Create New South Wales didn't engage in this? Because it seems to me that what you're saying now about what should be the primary direction of a Heritage Act, being protecting heritage, is not mentioned in your submission, and it's very much a secondary consideration at best in the government discussion paper. Is there a reason you haven't engaged in this?
Sorry, I'm just looking through the relevant parts of our submission, but I believe our submission has truly shown that the support that Create has of celebrating history and heritage properties and providing the framework for adaptive reuse of those facilities and providing a fertile ground, if you will, for their preservation into the future.
It's the chair speaking. Thank you, Ms. Pittman. It's now time for questions from the government. And I'll go firstly to Mr. Franklin.
Thanks very much, Chair. And I'll just pick up that point, if I may, with Ms. Pittman. You talk about, obviously, the adaptive reuse of heritage buildings. And I understand that Create Infrastructure has done a number of projects in this area. Basically, could you talk about what you view the benefits are of this approach to heritage conservation and to the arts, I guess, more broadly? And if you particularly wanted to talk about one or two specific examples where that's worked most effectively, that would be of assistance to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Yes, we do feel that heritage buildings can be given that new lease on life with new and compatible uses, and arts and cultural uses really suit that the adaptive reuse of heritage buildings. The maintenance and the reuse of those buildings has the social benefits for the community, and the community can really value those places with the adaptive use applied. Those adaptive uses can also be environmentally sustainable and economically efficient alternative to that new construction as a counterpoint. There are plenty of examples from the work that we've done. We have contributed to the Southern Highlands Gallery at Retford Park, which was an adaptive reuse of the dairy buildings in a regional art gallery on the National Trust Fairfax Estate at Retford Park. We've provided funding to the Albury City Council to transform their 1888 Albury Waterworks pump house into a makerspace and artist workshop. And on a larger scale, we, of course, are just nearing the completion of the Walsh Bay Arts Precinct, which is a wonderful example of adaptive reuse. That project has been all about restoring the industrial character of those wharves while also creating new and enhanced facilities to support the arts and cultural performances and events that happen inside them. The works that we've done to the Sydney Theatre Company, for instance, which sits within that precinct, were recently awarded the Sulman Award for public architecture as part of the New South Wales Architecture Awards. And the ability to take and preserve that industrial character of those wharves, but also create state-of-the-art, fit-for-purpose performance facilities within them is an example of the type of adaptive reuse and the real opportunity that cultural use for heritage buildings provides. Beyond that, of course, Carriage Works. We're currently working on improvements to the gunnery. The gunnery is a state heritage listed property that provides office and gallery and artist studio spaces. We are really looking at the reuse potential of that heritage site as a state-of-the-art interdisciplinary space for creating and showing contemporary art. So all of those projects demonstrate, I guess, the commitment around unlocking that potential of adaptive reuse of those heritage spaces and supporting cultural infrastructure needs across the state by using those spaces to create fit-for-purpose space for arts and cultural use.
Thanks, Ms. Pittman. Can I particularly congratulate you on the SDC building and the adaptation. It's excellent, and I commend any committee members to go and actually do the tour there. It's amazing. Can I just move to a different issue? Well, related but different issue. One of the things that's come up consistently throughout these inquiry hearings is the idea of particular incentives to obviously assist with the adaptation and reuse of heritage buildings and obviously protection. I note that you talked about supporting new incentives in your submission as well. Could you perhaps elaborate on where you think we might be able to go in terms of submissions, incentives, and what you think they could be and how they could be best effectively used?
Create does support the consideration of new initiatives, and our submission outlines that. Those initiatives should incentivize heritage ownership, conservation, adaptive reuse, activation, and investment. For arts and cultural organizations in particular, while I've just described how attractive adaptive reuse of heritage spaces is as an option, cost can definitely be a barrier to that. And new initiatives that could help to make that activation of heritage buildings more accessible for those organizations that we work with would be supported. These initiatives could comprise a number of regulatory or non-regulatory options, and that would include market-based solutions around options funded by government and the non-government sector. So that could include the examination of the feasibility of transferable development rights schemes. And Mr. Mackin spoke about the potential to expand the heritage floor space scheme outside of the Sydney CBD. That would, we believe that would have merit to consider. Zoning waivers to encourage the adaptive reuse of heritage listed spaces, consent fee waivers, innovative grant programs that maybe encourage some greater collaboration between the non-government sector and government, and use of heritage agreements as well. We are working with Heritage New South Wales and other governments on a number of committees to look at those options. But really, it's just looking at ways to make those dollars go further when it comes to refurbishing heritage buildings for that cultural use.
Thanks, Ms. Pittman. I might throw to my colleagues if they have any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. And Mr. Mallard raises his hand.
He does indeed. And thank you for your submissions and your time today on this virtual inquiry, as important as it is. Dr. Gapps, there was some suggestion by previous witnesses in their submissions that there should be an accreditation scheme for heritage practitioners. I know the answer to this myself, but I would like to ask your view. Do you think that there needs to be an accreditation scheme for heritage practitioners and brought into more regulation in the industry or sector?
Look, I'm not sure if I've got the expertise to comment on that more broadly, but my points were that I think increasing the accreditation or recognition of historians in that process would definitely be beneficial.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for that. And I mean, I open it up to anyone else who'd like to comment on that issue. Do you think it needs to be more accreditation, more regulation in the sector? I mean, I've got a history degree, believe it or not, so I could probably hang a shingle out and be a consultant. Do you think there needs to be more accreditation to keep people like me out?
Yeah.
Who was that? Who said yeah?
Perhaps if I chime in here, Mr. Mallard, I think the better benchmark you should look at is the Land and Environment Court's benchmark for who constitutes an expert witness. They have established in legal practice how to determine a particular person's expertise in determining these matters, and they go beyond just, I have a history degree as well, but they would probably grill me and discard some of my evidence if I held out that I was a heritage expert.
Well, Mr. Macken, being a former councillor, you've got great heritage background, but
I do. The law.
You have to declare a conflict of interest, or
that's right. But the law, the Land Environment Court might think different to you and I.
That's a very good answer and very good evidence. Thank you for that contribution. That's the end of my questions. Thank you.
Poulos?
Are there any other government questions? If not,
I actually do, Mr. Chair, if I may. And I've also got a question to Dr. Gapps, if that's okay. And my question is, if you think that there are enough training opportunities for heritage professionals and tradespeople working on heritage items, particularly in regional New South Wales?
Again, I don't think I have the information or expertise to answer that with any detail. But from my broad understanding, I think that there could be more opportunities, and it would be something that would be beneficial.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Are there any other government questions? If not, I'll allow Mr. Secord.
Yeah, one quick question to Ms. Pittman. You referred earlier to reuse and adaptive reuse. So what is going to happen to the relocated willow grove at Parramatta?
Thank you, Mr. Secord. The Willow Grove property will be carefully dismantled and relocated, as you mentioned, and works have commenced to carefully dismantle the building. There will be a consultation process that we are commencing to consider the future location, the future site for Willow Grove to be reconstructed on, and the future use of the property. And there's the Willow Grove Relocation Framework and Methodology Plan, which governs all of that work. The site selection process will ensure that the conservation values of Willow Grove are maintained. We will be looking at criteria that for the site, which we will develop in consultation with the community. We are very keen to hear the community's perspective on how we can return this asset into a real community asset and for use for the community for many years to come.
So where will it, in the meantime, where will it reside?
Point of order, Mr. Chair. We are still in government question time, and I note the time has expired. So I'm sure Mr. Secord has many questions to pop on notice to these witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. And I know Mr. Secord knows that I'm a generous chair, but we have to wrap it up. So I'll take this opportunity to thank Dr. Gapps, Ms. Anne Pittman, and Mr. Sean Macken for attending today and for your participation. We will now be taking a brief break until 11:45 a.m. A reminder to all members, if you could please ensure that you go on mute and turn off your videos until that time. Thanks once again to the witnesses. We will resume at 11:45 a.m. Ms. Veal, it's Chair Peter Poulos speaking. Could I ask you to help out with a quick sound check from your end, please?
Yes, hello, Chair. Nice to meet you virtually.
Thank you. You're coming through fine. And we're just waiting for the second witness to join us as well. Mr. Jowett, it's Peter Poulos, the Chair speaking. Could I ask you to assist by conducting a very quick sound check, please?
Hello, it's Roger Jowett at this end, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Well, good morning and welcome to the review of the Heritage Act 1977. The committee is resuming proceedings. I now welcome our next witnesses, Ms. Sharon Veal and Mr. Roger Jowett. Could each witness please state their name and position title and swear either an oath or affirmation? Starting with you, please, Ms. Veal.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Sharon Veal. I'm the CEO of GML Heritage, and I will swear an affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Ms. Veal. And Mr. Jowett, could I please ask you to also state your name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Roger Gavin Jowett. I'm a member of the Rail, Tram and Bus Union Retired Members Association. I act for the association on matters relating to heritage and all the activities of the association's members are undertaken on a voluntary basis. I'd like to swear an affirmation, but I don't have it in front of him. If you might be able to give some assistance in that regard, that'd be appreciated.
I'm happy to. If it's okay, do you mind just repeating the words after me?
Yes, thank you.
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jowett. And would both of you like to start by making a short statement? Ms. Veal?
Thank you, I would. I'm speaking today from Gadigal country, and I wish to acknowledge the strength and resilience of their culture and communities and their continuing patience and generosity. I think identity matters in all places to all people. Heritage anchors us and reaffirms our past. It builds self-esteem and can restore dignity. Heritage evidences and helps us understand our history and connects us to cultures, traditions, ways of life, and various values and meanings. Heritage, regardless of who owns and manages it, is part of our unique yet common humanity. Continuity and stability in our natural and cultural environments is more urgent than ever. Ideally, the conservation of heritage should transcend party politics and ministerial terms. We need to remind ourselves that we have a duty of care, a custodial responsibility to ensure heritage is protected and given life in the community. The benefits of investment in heritage are broadly misunderstood in New South Wales. And while there is some evidence to the contrary, the government has become more of a liquidator than the curator. The government's policy of asset recycling through sale as a core principle and means of alleviating budget pressure is out of step with the community. It has failed to adequately account for the significant cultural and social losses associated with this strategy. An inclusive green growth agenda is very much linked to the conservation of heritage. The benefits of investing in heritage for livability, community cohesion, job creation, and local economic development have been studied increasingly over recent years, with economic theory underpinning investment becoming substantially more robust. With few scholarly exceptions, Australia is well behind understanding this corpus of research and evidence. Our cities, towns, and landscapes differentiate us from competing locations, creating a unique brand nationally and internationally, which in turn attracts investment and people. Places that are most successful at attracting investment and business to meet the aspirations of their communities while promoting inclusion are those that harness all their resources comprehensively and collectively, including heritage. Clear strategy, inspired leadership, intergovernmental and interagency collaboration is required in New South Wales to achieve a better understanding of the vital contribution of heritage and what that contribution makes to our present and future. I welcome this inquiry into the Heritage Act. I acknowledge and appreciate the significant responsibilities of the committee to truly reflect and represent the public interest in heritage conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Veal. And Mr. Jowett, would you also like to provide the committee with a short opening statement?
Yes, before I do, I'd just like to similarly acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thanks for the opportunity to address the committee, Chair. I think it's a very important stage in legislative development because this Act has not been significantly reviewed for over 20 years. The time elapsed for the review suggests that the deliberations of this committee will be generational. So we urge that we are forward-looking. We have a look at the weaknesses, the strengths of the discussion paper and the reform proposals and the various suggestions and recommendations for change with an eye not only for this generation, but the next generation. In saying that, the association believes that there needs to be major changes to the Heritage Act. We look at the objectives and they are out of kilter, in our view, with community views. We look at the fact that the Heritage Act overwhelmingly, without punning, is constructed around the built fabric, is constructed around buildings, and when one looks at the terms of reference, building reuse comes up many times. So the association argues that there's been a change in our society in terms of ethnicity, in terms of diversity, in terms of ethnic minorities, and there is a need to reflect their stories and their contributions to our society. Not only is there a cultural and demographic change, there's also a change relating to our understanding of what goes on internationally. We refer to World Heritage listings, we refer to decisions made by various UNESCO committees in relation to industrial sites, in relation to factories, and in relation to the emerging issue of intangible cultural heritage. In that regard, we point to developments in Scotland. We referred to academic papers by Lucy Tasker, Professor Lucy Tasker from Macquarie University, in terms of the intangible cultural heritage, particularly at the iconic Everleigh Railway Workshops. In that regard, Ms. Tasker refers to the fact that invariably in New South Wales and under our Act, the focus is on buildings. So we have a look at the Everleigh site. The Everleigh workshops were the manufacturing base for the production, assembling and repair of locomotives. Yet one looks overall at the heritage, it's overwhelmingly focused on the buildings, which rightfully are well recognised, also a machine collection, but very rarely is the people who work in the buildings, the 4,000 odd employees, their experiences, their stories, their craft, their skills, their link to community, their social practices aren't referred to. We say that's a yawning gap in the heritage legislation, but also that translates into a package. It translates, in our view, the need for more diverse representation on the Heritage Council, whereby community representatives and experts in intangible cultural heritage can be added to the composition of that body. It extends to the work of New South Wales Heritage. In our view, there needs to be programs incorporating industrial cultural heritage, and that can be done in a number of ways. We instance the current strategic vision at North Everleigh and the possibility to incorporate in that not only building reuse, but also a vigorous pilot program related to the cultural heritage. In terms of the other aspects of the committee's discussion paper, there are some which the organisation endorses. Those are around heritage promotion, those are around areas of community involvement, and we make a number of comments in relation to commercial reuse. Now, commercial reuse, from our experience based on Everleigh, is a bit of a mixed bag. We asked the question, why should a large corporation, and one we gave evidence in relation to what had happened at Everleigh, why should they have incentives for commercial reuse of buildings? We say to the contrary. In fact, there should be a premium from these companies, because heritage in a whole range of circumstances gives a premium value to those who may purchase priority. Our focus in terms of commercial reuse is on the non-profit areas, on the social enterprise areas, and we suggested a mechanism by which, where in circumstances there is a sale of government-owned buildings, then that premium which attracts to heritage should be allocated to the funding of, for example, the Endangered Houses Trust. We pointed with approval to the developments in Victoria. So we argue within this activation of commercial reuse of buildings, there are a number of issues which need to be addressed. Thank you very much for the opportunity for the opening remarks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jowett. And now I invite committee members from the opposition to ask questions. And firstly, Mr. Buttigieg.
Thank you both for appearing. Roger, I might just ask you a question in relation to your opening statement and your submission, which stresses the importance of intangible cultural heritage and how hitherto it hasn't been facilitated in the Act. I just wonder, I suppose it's a two-part question. Conceptually, we all understand, I think, what we mean by intangible cultural heritage. I'm just keen to understand, perhaps by way of example, because you say in your submission that you've been advocating for the recognition of the labour movement's intangible cultural history at the former railways workshops, industrial sites. People generally think that they think of a space and they think of, as you said, old machinery or antiquated buildings that look good, and then to try and then conceptualize what we mean by intangible cultural, the people who may have worked there, their history, their stories. Can you give us some concrete examples of how that would be manifested in practice? And secondly, whether or not you think the Act is facilitative enough for that particular part of heritage?
Thanks for the question. Going to the second part of your question first, in relation to the Act, Definitely, the organisations think that the current Act doesn't facilitate ICH. In fact, it deters it because it doesn't give an opening for the parties to explore items of intangible cultural heritage, because when one examines the structure of the Act, the structure of the supporting institution, the objectives, the composition of the Heritage New South Wales, their work program, their corporate plan, it does not refer at all to intangible cultural heritage. In relation to practical expression of intangible cultural heritage, one example is the North Eveleigh Redfern Strategic Vision paper recently released early in the year by Transport for New South Wales. Now, overwhelmingly, the strategic vision is about the reuse of heritage listed railway buildings, and there are some over 20 references in that rather thin paper to commercial reuse. Now, the association in its submission pointed out that there is a long history in relation to the labour which was at the Eveleigh Carriage Works. Now, the Eveleigh Carriage Works were responsible for the assembly and repair of the New South Wales rolling stock fleet for over 100 years. That 100 years meant that there were many issues relating to the social institutions of those workers, the fact that on many occasions migrant workers came into the workshop. There were struggles by the unions in the workshops for improved workers' rights, for improved health and safety, for the rights of Aboriginals, for equal pay, for women workers, and a multitude of day-to-day activities which were part of working class culture. That included politicians who came out of the workshops. The Labor movement had premiers, had governor-generals who came out of the Eveleigh locomotive workshops. There were historic moments in New South Wales history where those workshops were at the technological forefront of manufacturing work in New South Wales. Those workshops were the heart of the railways. There were social institutions, there were social clubs. There was a dynamic between that industrial community and the local community, which worked at the sporting level, the religious level, and at the political level. This is the intangible cultural history which we refer to. I think the Scots put it very well, and they said that you don't understand the intangible or the tangible, the built, the factories, the buildings, without understanding the intangible and taking that into account, and vice versa. I finished by posing the question, what is a factory, an industrial site with buildings, machines? What is it? What does it produce? What does it mean if you don't put the people and their institutions into it?
So, Roger, thank you for that. I just want to drill down a bit because it's an important sort of point. I think the question is how do you communicate that intangible history? I mean, the obvious answer, storyboards or interactive press buttons and of a sort of thing you see in a museum type thing. But is it because, is that part of the challenge to in a physical space that people are looking at, usually interacting with aesthetically, then trying to convert written history and communicate with people in those spaces? Is that part of the issue, or is it that's not really the issue? The issue is we just haven't been doing it.
Well, I think it's both, to be frank. That there, in relation to Eveleigh, there is a lot of historical material in which we can source a modern representation of intangible cultural history. So, for example, the machines which operate at Eveleigh workshops, it was steam powered. It was an era in which the workshops were referred to as a city within a city. Now, those machines, those experiences, the OHS, the danger, the dirt, the noise, is captured in photographs. It's captured in stories. It's captured in oral histories. There's a lot of material in relation to social practices. So in terms of marrying that body of work, why this period is particularly exciting for intangible cultural history, because of the digitisation, because of technology, there are means of expressing that intangible cultural history which hitherto haven't been available. So we say it's an exciting time. There needs, in terms of gauging intangible cultural history, the need for historians to be involved, for former workers to be involved, and that mix of skills gives us the ability to frame and to fashion a quite considerable body of expression of what is intangible cultural heritage in a practical form.
Thank you for that, Roger. The other theme that you've highlighted, which I think is somewhat unique or in terms of the evidence we've had to date, is this, and you touched on it in your opening statement and you also highlighted in your submission as well, and it's a very well-made point when you think about it. The idea that well-resourced corporate conglomerates would be able to get government funding when they actually may be advantageous for them by virtue of its heritage nature to invest. And you gave the example of, I think it was Mirvac, wasn't it, where so the value add, the profit incentive is already there. And what you're saying is that if we're going to have limited funds of government, they should be targeted to not-for-profit or social enterprises rather than people like the Mirvacs who have the wherewithal and the profit motive to make it work. Did you want to elaborate on any of that?
Yes, I think it's an important subject, and thanks for the question. It relates to, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. The subject matter was relating to commercial incentives for reuse. And what I referenced was the practical example experienced by the association, the redevelopment and repurposing of the Everleigh locomotive workshops. So the company involved is one of Australia's largest AXS listed companies. It invested $500 million in 3 commercial buildings. It invested $160 million in repurposing the workshop for high-end retail and commercial purposes. In those circumstances, I don't think that company would warrant a commercial incentive to reuse a public building. I also pointed to the fact of the strategic vision paper released by the Transport for New South Wales about repurposing of railway assets in North Everleigh. Now, the paper itself admits that in many circumstances, and there's a lot of international literature which supports this, that in fact there is a premium commercially for repurposed heritage listed buildings, and that's admitted to in that paper. Now, what the association says in adopting a attitude and a principle of one size doesn't fit all is to make a division, a dividing line between the commercial enterprises, the large commercial enterprises, and the not-for-profits and social enterprises, and suggested a mechanism by which funding from where there might be limited sale of public assets could be redirected and used as seed funding in a number of the enterprises quoted in boxes 1, 2, and 3 of that section of the paper.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think opposition's out of time. Is that right, Chair?
Thank you, Deputy Chair, and thank you, Mr. Jowett, for your response. I'll now invite members of the crossbench if they have a question.
Yes, Reverend Fred Nile.
Thank you, Reverend Nile.
One for Sharon Veal. Ms. Veal, many submissions have stated that the Heritage Council lacks heritage skills and knowledge, but how involved in each project do Heritage Council members have to be? in regards to heritage conservation, community outcomes and needs. What's your response to that?
Sorry, I'm not sure that I understand the question. Are you asking how should the Heritage Council be involved in heritage?
Yes. Well, they're stating that the Heritage Council lacks heritage skills and knowledge.
Yes.
Criticism.
Okay, so
how do they get involved?
Well, I think the Heritage Council needs to have a broad range of representation from the community. It needs to be inclusive and it needs to be diverse. But just as importantly, it needs to have the range of skills and capability that contribute to a deeper understanding of heritage and its value to the community. I think what we've noticed over more recent years with the appointments to the Heritage Council is there's been a diminution of the skill and capability with respect to heritage matters, particularly in respect to history, cultural landscapes, Aboriginal heritage, industrial heritage, movable heritage, the range and diversity, living heritage. I resist the use of intangible heritage. I think it's living heritage, and it really is not necessarily distinguishing between the physical and the immaterial, or the material and the physical. They are interdependent. And I agree that in terms of understanding and protecting heritage, that perhaps when you're trying to fix in or schedule particular places, that living values become a statutory conundrum because you're not sure what you're trying to fix in place. But it's really about recognising and encouraging and celebrating and commemorating those values as part of the life within communities at places. And I think the Heritage Council really needs to have a broad, diverse, inclusive representation of not only heritage matters and practice, but also of the community more generally. Thank you.
Thank you. In your submission, you also mentioned commission research to inform the development of a strategic response to the recognition of living heritage within the community of New South Wales. Could you just outline what you mean by living heritage? And is there some gap in the way our Heritage Council is operating?
Yes, I think in terms of living heritage, and I use that term interchangeably with intangible heritage or immaterial heritage, I think, yes, our understanding of heritage has changed through time. It's much more inclusive and diverse, and that reflects the composition and nature of contemporary society. I think that the heritage listings process does not necessarily always inclusively take account of those living heritage values, and we see that particularly with regard to First Nations history and heritage. We've seen that the way Aboriginal communities or First Nations communities transition their knowledge through generations, their cultural practices and traditions is not well reflected or able to be protected through heritage legislation. And I think having a strategic view and understanding of what is important to today's communities with respect to heritage is really important. And we haven't had a good look at that as a government or as a state for a considerable period of time. There is, for example, no heritage strategy for New South Wales. We are well behind other states and territories and other best practice in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Chair. I just might, noting we're about halfway through crossbench time, take over from here if that's all right.
Mr. Shoebridge, thank you.
Look, can I thank you both for your submission and your work more broadly, protecting and celebrating heritage. Ms. Bill, I found one particular sentence of your submission worthy of perhaps some additional well, amongst others, worthy of some additional thought from you. You say that the guiding themes for this legislative review of the Heritage Act 1977 are intriguing. Did you want to expand on that a little?
Thank you very much. I must say, when I read the discussion paper, I was somewhat concerned about the lack of rigour, the lack of evidence underpinning many of the assumptions. It seemed to me to rely on a very stereotypical, outmoded way of thinking about heritage. I was very concerned by the pillars, for want of a better word, of making heritage easy, putting heritage to work, and making it relevant. I think for First Nations people, making heritage easy is profoundly, it's frankly insulting. And I found that for them, heritage hasn't been easy, and it never will be. We've seen the continuing and ongoing destruction of Aboriginal cultural heritage across Australia, not just within New South Wales. And I know that's a separate matter and it's subject to other processes. But putting heritage to work, heritage is already hard at work. It's hard at work in the government's asset recycling strategy. It's hard at work for large-scale corporations and ASX-listed companies. It's hard at work in our local communities. It's been constantly adapted, demolished, and given life in communities in many, many ways. And I'm really not sure what the underlying driving force or motivation for this inquiry is, in terms of when you look at the composition and structure of the State Heritage Register and the number of properties on it, which by comparison to other states and territories is low, and the composition of it is largely state properties, it begs the question, in my view.
We've had a series, yeah. We've had a series of submissions, not least from the National Trust, pointing out that those, I think they're described as 3 key policy themes in the government's discussion paper, are kind of missing the point. They're adequate secondary objectives by all means, but the primary objective of any review of the Heritage Act should be identifying, protecting and enhancing heritage, or some version of those thoughts. What's your thoughts on that, Ms. Veal?
Yes, the primary aim of the Heritage Act is to conserve the state's environmental heritage. I think that aim is the true north of what the state should be doing in terms of heritage. I think we tend to have a fairly ad hoc approach to the management of heritage. I think we're still trying to fit it into a planning system that is not comprehensive and not thinking of heritage holistically as part of neighbourhoods, as part of character areas, as part of precincts. We look at places on a project by project basis, and whilst there's some changes in that regard, we really need to be looking at sort of management plans for larger areas that actually talk to the local community and really take account of participatory planning to actually understand what's of value to people.
So, Ms. Veal, in many ways, it's not the architecture of the Act that's the problem. It's the failure for governments to really act upon that, adequately fund heritage, and then do things like a comprehensive state heritage strategy. We'd be better off looking at those major gaps in the system rather than trying to fundamentally change an Act that many people have said is broadly working, at least for non-Aboriginal heritage. Would that be fair to say?
I think that would be fair to say. I think whilst obviously the administration of the Act and some of the interpretation of it may have caused delays or perhaps lack of consistency in some of the decisions that have been made, overall, the Act continues to serve its purpose. We have got a strong representation of heritage conserved and protected. However, I think the missing piece is that higher level strategic approach from government that actually determines and understands what is important to the state. What is the experience of New South Wales that we want to present to the world, that we want to provide to our local communities? What is it that we want to say about ourselves through our heritage? What is unique and special?
Thanks, Mr. Jarrett. I know that you would want, and I've be quite frank, I endorse your position that intangible heritage needs to be written into the Act. But other than that, do you agree with, adopt, or have qualifications about that broader view about where the attention should be in terms of this space from Ms. Bell?
I should take on notice.
I'm in a position to make a comment. I think it needs to be both the Act, which we see as needing a degree of refurbishment because of community expectations, and also a greater understanding of what intangible cultural heritage is. From our experience in the planning system through development applications, there needs to be a greater integration between the EPA Act and the Heritage Act. And of course, there needs to be some strategic repositioning. When we look at the corporate plan of Heritage New South Wales, when we look at the performance objectives, when we drill down the composition of the Heritage Council, we can see that there are a number of areas which are excluded. So we say there needs to be a more integrated approach, a better interagency approach, and greater attention given to a heritage strategy. So ours is both a strategic and also a legislative response, and also a package of government institutions. It's not only the Act, but also those who apply heritage in a day-to-day sense through Heritage New South Wales. They have not been involved one iota in intangible cultural heritage, to our knowledge, at the Everleigh sites, whilst they've been excellent when it comes to built heritage and the machinery collection. And that's the example of a yawning gap, in our view, that can be addressed and should be addressed by this committee and subsequent changes coming through the government's white paper.
It's the chair speaking. Thank you, Mr. Jowett. I'll now invite government members to raise questions, and I'll go to Mr. Mallard.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for your submissions and your evidence today on this virtual hearing. My questions are straightforward. They won't include editorial comment. I'd like to ask both of you your view on, and I asked this question earlier today, the view on the need for, do you think there's a need for accreditation for heritage practitioners working in the field of heritage assessment right through the whole landscape?
Well, I'm happy to answer that question, at least to start the conversation. Accreditation in the heritage industry has been long talked about, certainly been on the radar of Australia ICOMOS for many years. And obviously there are many accredited professionals, whether they be architect, registered planners, or professional historians and engineers, etc., that play into the heritage space. I think we find, particularly in the development and assessment processes, that standards across the industry vary quite significantly. And certainly, I think there could be some rigour applied to that if accreditation was a consideration of the inquiry.
Okay.
Just in response to your question, Mr. Mallard, we make a comment from a different perspective of not being professional, not being part of the industry, being a voluntary organisation where professional skills probably are at a premium, but certainly in terms of passion and desire for better outcomes, that's our motivation. But also I think one needs to temper issues around professionalism accreditation with an essential thrust of the discussion paper, which is about community involvement, community driven, and community education. So from our point of view as a non-profit organisation with members in regional areas where education about heritage issues is at a minimum, these are the areas, in our view, should be the focus of the committee's decision. And from our experience and background, we'd point the committee towards resources in terms of education, in terms of what are the consultative processes and means of engagement for community members. And that's the end which we would prefer to concentrate on.
I think that's very good evidence, Mr. Jowett. The issue of citizen historians, sort of balancing between the two of the professionals and the well-informed community members bringing forward their heritage arguments. My final question, I see my colleague, Mr. Franklin, may want to ask a question, was, I think, directed more to Ms. Vale in terms of the professional area. Do you think there are enough heritage training opportunities to support, if we go to accreditation, to support the accreditation, to heritage training opportunities across the spectrum again, from local government to private sector and consultant?
In terms of people coming into the industry, do you mean?
Yeah, or even Mr. Jowett, I'd like to upskill.
Yeah, no, I don't think there are actually. And I would echo Mr. Jowett's comments. I think community engagement in heritage is actually the social and cultural license that heritage needs. You haven't got heritage without the stories and memories and attachments.
Absolutely.
And connections within the community. And actually in many instances, they are the true knowledge holders, and professionals from whatever disciplines are the facilitators, or can be the facilitators of those processes, because sometimes the processes and systems are quite tricky and complicated. Having said that, I think training opportunities and pathways into heritage are not readily available. I know anecdotally that GML Heritage is one of the larger employers of heritage professionals in New South Wales, but we're not the only one.
We need to move on because we've got limited time. The pathways for training is a very good point, and we must pick that up in our report. I defer to my colleague, Mr. Franklin.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mr. Mallett. Thanks, Chair. And thank you both for being here today. My question's also to Ms. Veal, if that's okay, in your professional capacity. So I guess in talking about the way that state heritage listed items are managed under the Act, your submission says the system's already nuanced. Now, I guess I was reflecting on that and thinking that's probably clear to heritage professionals, but for owners, homeowners, people who are managing their own heritage properties themselves, it might be less easy to navigate. So I was wondering if you can reflect on that, the challenges to homeowners a little, and like, for example, do you have owners coming to you for support preparing their CMPs, their works applications, their assessments, and so on to navigate the approvals process? Can you give us some idea about the complexity for homeowners, the sort of costs that they that it usually costs, and any other issues that we can address in our report?
Well, if in terms of residential properties that are listed on the State Heritage Register that are owned by private individuals, that's a very small minority of properties. If you're talking more broadly about local heritage items or homes or residences that are within heritage conservation areas, yes, obviously LEPs require heritage impact statements. If you haven't owned a heritage property prior, it can be something of a challenge to understand what is required. Absolutely, I concur. But I think going back to some earlier points, I think that education and broad understanding of heritage and its actual what can and can't be done is not necessarily always well communicated. Some councils are terrific and provide a lot of resources to their local residents, but it's variable across New South Wales.
Thank you. I think my colleague, Mr. Martin, might have a question before government time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Franklin. I've got a question for the RTBU. And in my view, Transport Heritage have done fantastic work in celebrating movable heritage. particularly with its heritage fleet, of course. How do you think this could be expanded going forward?
There was a review, as you might be aware, of the rail transport heritage space in 2013. There was a consolidation of the heritage organisations into Transport Heritage, which is sustained by government grants. In our submission, we made reference to the success of the rail heritage tourism sector in terms of number of visits to their museum and also the number of passengers. I think there needs to be greater interagency cooperation. I think there needs to be greater involvement of Destination New South Wales. There are and have been issues relating to access to the railway network of getting train paths. So that's been an ongoing problem and needs greater attention to it. Also in terms of the cooperation with interstate tourism, also there needs to be an international focus. Our research indicates that it's a potentially booming part of the heritage sector. And just the idea of steam, a bit of grit in the eye, wind in the hair, that's really the stuff which gets the punters out in their droves, I have to say. So thanks very much for the question. I think there's a real opportunity for that sector to blossom.
Well, thank you very much for the answer. And now that you've said that, I distinctly remember getting soot in my eye a few times, once at the Zigzag Railway. And on top of that, I remember the 3801 featuring heavily in my childhood. So thank you, Mr. Jowett.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jowett. Thank you, Mr. Jowett, and thank you, Mr. Martin.
Red rattlers are mine.
I'll take this opportunity to sincerely thank both Ms. Veal and Mr. Jowett for attending this hearing and for participating. We'll be farewelling shortly the witnesses, and members, if you could stay with us for a brief interaction straight after. Just some observations. As a committee, we undertook the first ever fully virtual hearing by a Legislative Council committee. Over 5 separate hearings, together we have connected with 43 witnesses. I thank all witnesses for attending and contributing, as well as all interested stakeholders and individuals who took the time to make a submission to this inquiry. I extend once again my appreciation to all committee members for their assistance and input during these hearings. Similarly, I thank the staff of the Secretariat for their ongoing professionalism and guidance in helping to facilitate these virtual hearings. I wish everyone a pleasant afternoon. Keep safe. And this concludes today's hearing.
Thank you.